This is the Sony FX30, an $1,800 cinema camera, which is the cheapest cinema camera that Sony offers for video creators. But how does this little camera stack up against this? This is the Sony Burano, the latest Cine Alta camera that Sony has released that costs a whopping $25,000. Obviously, these are very different cameras with different use cases and come at very different price points, but I personally began to wonder, can the cheapest cinema camera in Sony's lineup compete with their latest and greatest release that costs well over 10 times the price? For starters, let's check out these side-by-side comparisons of some different scenes that I shot with these two cameras to see if you can tell the difference. One of the cameras is labeled camera A and the other camera B, and let's just let these clips play for a minute here. All right, those are some quick side-by-sides, and make sure to stick around for the end where I'll reveal which camera was camera A and which one was camera B. But let's first talk about the Sony Burano and the Sony FX30 and just the basic specs of these cameras. Let's start with the Sony FX30, which is an APS-C crop sensor size camera, so it has a much smaller sensor than the Sony Burano, and comes in at $1,800 for the body only. This was released back in September of 2022, and it's the cheapest Sony FX series camera right below the Sony FX3. Now, the Sony Burano is a full-frame cinema camera that cost $25,000 for just the body and the viewfinder, not even this little side handle, this little control handle on the side. That's like another $3,000. This camera started shipping to consumers back in February of 2024, so it's very, very new. And this is the third most expensive Cine Alta series camera that Sony makes right now. So this sits right below the Venice 2, the 6K, and the 8K camera models. So we're talking about top-of-the-line technology here. So the way I'm going to do this comparison is sort of run through some of the specs and the features of each of these cameras and compare them against each other for the respective category we're talking about. First, we're going to talk about resolutions and frame rates. With the FX30, we get a 26 megapixel APS-C sensor, and this is actually a 6K sensor that then downsamples to 4K for video recording. I've always loved the way the images look coming out of the Sony FX30. I think it's a beautiful image, and it has Sony's brand new color science that we see in the Sony FX3, the A7S III, the Sony FX6, and basically all of the new Sony cameras, the same color science applies to the Sony FX30. And with the Sony Burano, we get an 8.6K full frame image sensor, and this image is absolutely beautiful. I really can't complain much about the Sony Burano's image. It's beautiful in every regard. What's interesting though is when you start looking at the different specifications, how similar these get when you bump the Burano down from that 8K image down to 6K or 5K or 4K. It actually starts to act oddly similar to the Sony FX30, and in a lot of ways, the Burano is actually a better crop sensor camera than it is a full frame camera. It's kind of confusing to explain all the different resolutions and frame rates that the Sony Burano shoots in and the different crops that it adds to its image. But the main thing that I want to highlight is that the moment you're not shooting in 8K and you bump it down to 6K, you're actually not getting a full frame image anymore. It does do a full frame crop at 6K, so you're kind of reducing your overall field of view. And then if you want to shoot at anything less than 6K, so 5.8K or 4K, you now have a Super 35 crop, which is basically the equivalent of the Sony FX30. When it comes to ISO and noise performance with the Sony FX30 and the Burano, both of these have two base ISO sensitivities, which simply means that these cameras have been optimized to shoot at the most dynamic range at two different ISO values. For the FX30, those values are 800 and 2500, and then in the Burano, it's 800 and 3200. So really close for the base sensitivities, but the Burano is just way better at keeping noise down at the higher ISO values because of its really large image sensor. The FX30 certainly isn't horrible as far as noise performance, but because it is a much smaller APS-C sensor, the image quality certainly suffers at higher ISO values. When it comes to dynamic range when shooting in S-Log, which is the log profile of these Sony cameras that gives you a really flat image and retains the most highlight and shadow information in your image, the FX30 is going to get 14 plus stops of dynamic range, and the Burano is going to get 16 stops. So honestly, way closer than I thought it would be. And while the 2 stops of dynamic range would be really helpful for shooting in really dynamic environments where you have a ton of blacks, a ton of shadows, and a lot of highlight information, when shooting YouTube content like this or B-roll in my studio, I'm really able to control the lighting in my scene. So practically this wouldn't make much of a difference to me having 14 or 16 stops of dynamic range. Both are just a ton of dynamic range. When it comes to image stabilization, the FX30 has a 5-axis in-body stabilization. So this is hardware. This is kind of almost like a gimbal you could think of inside of the camera to keep that sensor stable when you're moving the camera. Plus it also also adds active steady shot, which is software stabilization to stabilize the image even further. Now the Burano does not have that active steady shot feature, but it does have 5-axis in-body stabilization. And the Burano is the first of its kind to include both an internal ND filter with built-in stabilization. There's not any other cinema camera at this point that has both of those features. And then for lens compatibility, the FX30 shoots on the Sony E-mount system, and then the Burano shoots on the Sony E-mount system plus the RE-PL mount. So the Burano, you're gonna get way more lens options to shoot at like $20,000 or $30,000 lenses from the RE systems, and then the FX30 is gonna be limited just to the Sony E-mount system or third-party E-mount lenses. A quick word from our sponsor of this video, Epidemic Sound.
If you're a content creator or YouTuber that's looking for music or sound effects for your videos, then you've got to check out Epidemic Sound. Epidemic Sound has the best selection of music for your videos that allow you to monetize with no issues, and you can search according to mood, music style, beats per minute, so that every time you find that perfect track. And the reason I love Epidemic Sound is, number one, the music is amazing, but number two, you have full rights to monetize your content on YouTube and social media wherever you're using their songs. So if you're ready to take your videos to the next level and access the largest music and sound effects catalog of its kind, just use the link in the description down below to take advantage of this special offer. All right, let's jump back into the video.
Okay, that's all the technical stuff, but what about the practicality of using either of these cameras? How easy are they to actually use for production work or for YouTube content like this, setting it up in a tripod in your studio or going out into the field and shooting B-roll for your YouTube content? Would it be beneficial to have something like the Sony Burano if you could afford it? Or is the FX30 or the FX3 something like a smaller mirrorless package actually the better option? And after using these two cameras, I feel like especially when it comes to the ergonomic differences, the Sony FX30 absolutely blows the Sony Burano out of the water. The FX30 is just so easy to use. The menus are really easy to navigate quickly. The flip out screen on the FX30 is so easy and convenient to work with. If you want to be able to view your image on the Sony Burano, it takes a lot of time to reorient that monitor to be able to look at yourself, or you have to start running additional cables like SDI or HDMI into a monitor to be able to see yourself quickly. The FX30 is lighter, it's easier to carry around all day, and the Burano is super heavy and hard to carry around. And while it produces an outstanding image, in order to get this camera functional in the way that I'd like to have it, you have to rig up a bunch of stuff on it, like an external monitor, a V-mount battery that adds a lot of weight, even if you're using some of the smaller V-mount batteries from a company like SmallRig. This camera gets very heavy very quickly, and it's not as easy to just go out and get some B-roll with the Sony Burano as it is the Sony FX30. Another practicality piece is the fact that the Sony FX30 is only an APS-C sensor, so you can purchase Sony APS-C lenses for this, which saves you a lot of money instead of going for the full frame option. Now, of course, you can change the Burano into the Super 35 modes, which there are multiple modes and multiple frame rates that it requires you to shoot in that Super 35 sensor style. But most people who use the Sony Burano probably want to leverage the 8K or 6K options, which would require a full frame field of view, which will just increase your cost substantially to shoot with the Sony Burano. You're easily talking $30,000 to $35,000 to get this camera functional and operational for production work. But with the FX30, for definitely under $3,000, maybe even around $2,500 or $2,800, you can get the Sony FX30 with the top handle and a APS-C style lens, and you're ready to shoot high quality content. Now, circling back to these tests that we showed at the beginning of the video, maybe you guessed it, but camera A is the Sony Burano and camera B is the FX30. As you can see, the FX30 holds up really nicely compared to the Sony Burano, and we used the same lens for this test, the Sony 24-70 f2.8 lens. To me, at least, it isn't super easy to tell which is which, and you would think that it would be way more clear with the large disparity in price point between these two cameras, but honestly, these look really similar. So my main encouragement to you as a fellow YouTuber and somebody who has worked on documentary films and worked in production for many, many years, we live in a day and age where you do not need $30,000 in order to make incredible content. With something as simple as the Sony FX30 or even the A6700, which has the exact same sensor as the FX30, you can have cinema level results for a consumer price point. I recently went out with some colleagues of mine and we shot sort of a professional development proof of concept film, and we used the Burano for the entirety of that project. And what we noticed is that while this camera is designed to use for solo operators, it was way easier to use with multiple people assisting our director of photography. So truly, if you are a solo YouTube creator or you run a small business or a small video production company, I wouldn't even consider something like the Burano or even the Sony FX9 or the Venice, because honestly, a camera like this, while it is really cool to use and produces a great image, you're going to have way way more problems and headaches that you need to solve than if you were to just gravitate towards something like the Sony FX30. If you want to know how to maximize the Sony FX30 for video purposes, go ahead and click or tap the screen right here so you can learn the best video settings for your Sony FX30. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.